All right, go ahead.
Good evening, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us tonight. My name is Rama Kudemi. I'm the Director of Grassroots Organizing at the U.S. Campaign for Palestinian Rights, a national coalition of hundreds of groups working together for freedom, justice, and equality. This webinar that we're going to be hosting tonight about Zionism and its global impact is part of our Together We Rise Palestine as a Model of Resistance curriculum, where we've been exploring all year long connections and lessons learned from movements for justice in order to strengthen our collective work. Earlier this month, we marked 100 years since the British issued the Balfour Declaration, which declared support for the establishment of a, quote, national home for the Jewish people in Palestine. Later this month, will mark 70 years since the United Nations recommended partition of Palestine against the will of its native Palestinian population. Both the Balfour Declaration and the partition plan set the stage for the Zionist movement's colonization of Palestine and subsequent establishment of the State of Israel. The settler colonial project of Zionism continues to have an impact on Palestinians today as Israel further displaces Palestinians off their land and still denies millions of Palestinian refugees their right to return to their homes. Tonight, we'll be discussing how Zionism has not only affected Palestinians, but people across the region and the world. Israel's ability to maintain its settler colonial project depends on the complicity and active support of other oppressive regimes in the region, and it also depends on the economic and political power it has built, exporting the strategies and tools to other forces worldwide, strategies and tools it has developed repressing Palestinians. So we'll be discussing these topics tonight, as well as what it means for us organizing in the US in support of Palestinian rights with the Palestinian Youth Movement, a transnational independent grassroots movement of young Palestinians dedicated to the liberation of their homeland and people. Our speakers tonight are Jennifer Mughannam and Nadia Tannous. Jennifer is a PhD candidate in ethnic studies and the strategy advisor for the National Executive Board of PYM, Palestinian Youth Movement. She formerly served as the research and development coordinator for PYM's International Executive Board. Her research documents the formalized alliance between the Palestinian Liberation Organization and the Lebanese national movement during Lebanon's civil war, situating it within the analysis on revolutionary praxis, resistance, and gendered labor in social movements. Nadia is the general coordinator of PYM USA and education and advocacy coordinator at Interfaith Peace Builders. Nadia holds an MSc in refugee and forced migration studies from the University of Oxford and a BA in anthropology and global information social enterprise studies from UC Santa Cruz. She is a passionate community organizer with a focus on refugee rights, transitional justice, youth education, and community empowerment movement. And the agenda for tonight is we're going to let them both present, and then we're going to open it up for questions, but also feel free to chat, as Anna was saying, using the chat box to also chat in questions. So thank you both for joining us tonight.
Thank you for having us.
Thank you so much, Rama. And thank you, Anna, for hosting us. Hopefully y'all can hear us well, but please let us know if you can't. Rama, does it sound good from our microphone? Okay, excellent. So hi, everybody. Thank you so much for joining us today. It's actually funny because Jennifer and I are both in Washington, D.C. right now. And so we're here situated in the lobby of the Middle East Studies Association conference. And so it's been a really interesting week, or weekend rather, of engaging in a lot of the conversations that we're going to have today. But here it's been on a much more regional level and looking at oppressive forces outside of Zionism, working with Zionism, etc. As Rama said, we're kind of going to delve into just the beginnings of Zionism in the region, in Palestine and Palestine in particular, and then talk about regionally how Zionism kind of invested itself, imposed itself, enacts itself through different powers in the region and different cases in the region, if you will. meaning the Middle East. And then from there, we're going to open it up into a more global conversation with a couple of just contextualizations throughout history, and kind of end, of course, with a conversation of what we do about it here in the United States.
So just to respond to Catherine, Nadia and I are both in the Palestinian Youth Movement, and Nadia works for the Interfaith Peace Builders, and I'm a PhD student at UC San Diego.
Yeah, good catch.
Okay.
So when we talk about Zionism's beginnings, at least as it manifests in the Middle East, I think many of us on the webinar have seen some of the memes and graphics that U.S. campaign have been putting up about Zionism in their own words, right? So folks like Moshe Dayan, Theodore Herzl, Ben-Gurion, etc., really talking about, in very clear terms, some of their views for Zionism as it turned into a political project in the Middle East. And so just when, I don't think we need to delve into that largely in this call or in this webinar, but I think something really important to keep in mind is that the establishment of the State of Israel was synonymous with the expulsion of people. And so it created a refugee diaspora in the Middle East and across the world of Palestinians, which is how Jennifer and I got here today in the United States. And so the refugee diaspora, or the diaspora of the Palestinian people, is a population transfer. It's an immigration flow. And that's also a theme that I think Jennifer and I will touch on when we talk about immigration flows throughout the region of the Middle East, but particularly as well in the Americas. Yeah.
So yeah, just to echo what Nadia said, I think it's also really important to situate Zionism within a broader historical context, which of course we can't touch on in its entirety today, but just to think about, for several decades preceding the state, in the late 1800s, Zionism was established as an ideological movement and has many different layers of sort of building toward a state building project. So it wasn't something that just manifested very quickly, but rather it was from the late 1880s up until 1948, almost about, roughly 50 years of a concerted effort to try to create ideological movement and mobilize people toward a state building project, a national state building project. As Nadia highlighted, it also manifested as a settler colonial project, displacing hundreds of thousands of Palestinian refugees and also killing many more, which I'm sure many of you are aware of. But so I wanted to talk first a little bit about the regional context and thinking about the expulsion of people into the near diaspora, the refugee diaspora, in the neighboring Arab countries, so mainly thinking about Lebanon, Syria, Jordan, some Egypt, and then there are some that went a little bit further, but specifically the places where refugee camps were in existence. The refugee camp condition is, it manifests in different host countries differently, but each of these things are connected to the relationships that Zionism maintains in proximity to the host governments in each of these contexts. So when we think about the host countries in this particular moment, post 1948 and beyond, that we also have to situate these countries in a place, and we're commemorating Balfour, and there's some other British and French colonial history with the mandates in these regions. So we're situating the expulsion and the movement to these different countries at a time where they were newly established. And so there's so this is the time when the mandates move towards independent states, but what that system did was it actually crystallized imperial relations with the former colonial powers or mandate powers in those different countries. So, and then we see, especially after World War II, a sort of transition from French and British Empire in those Arab states to U.S. Empire, and also the Soviet Union to some degree. But these global state relations configure how Zionism related to those states. So for example, in Jordan, we have a situation, so each of these things manifest differently, but there's a very tense sort of conflict in identity between Palestinians and Jordanians in Jordan because of the state building project of Jordan and the ties that it now maintains with the Zionist state. And so there's this scapegoating that sometimes happens. And so we see that in Jordan, while many Palestinian refugees were nationalized, there's still a relationship of both second-class citizenry, particularly in the refugee camps, and also through documentation, but also we have a situation where Zionism in Jordan has direct economic consequences. So for example, free trade agreements were specifically brokered in places like by the Red Sea in Aqaba, and that served to benefit sort of Zionist profit and global profit within a third world Arab nation. And the nation's hands are really tied in this capacity. We also see in Jordan that there is actual settlements, factory settlements that produce different goods in Jordan. So this idea of settlement is not just one that impacts Palestinians in the West Bank or across Palestine as a whole, but it also is something that impacts other Arab nations. This is also the same with the Golan Heights and the southern Lebanese border. So we can see Zionism as an expansive project for the acquisition of land in the region, and that impacts the different governments, especially on the along the borders, and also their relationship to economies. So in Lebanon, we see a situation where there's really dire conditions in the camps. This is part of the sort of post-colonial or post-independence process of state building for Lebanon that was really ushered in and supported by both the United States and the Zionists. Lebanon's a very complicated context with various sort of religious and class dimensions of rule and how that relates to empires and Zionism. But those things manifest in a way where so the Arab states, or the state of Lebanon, for example, and other ones, but maintain the sort of Zionist desire of the suppression of Palestinian resistance and agency through the ways in which the camp situation in the host countries is dealt with. Syria is a little bit different, although we can see now today that the sort of regional configurations of power that have impacted the situation in Syria presently have resulted in a new wave of refugeehood, of course, for Syrians and also for Palestinians for a second or third time. And this is connected to the larger context of acquisition of power in the region, battles for natural resources, for control of government decisions, and like serving the interests of different empires. And Najee's going to talk a little bit later about how Israel and United States sort of imperial and power desires are co-constitutive and kind of build off of one another. But I just wanted to give some insight about how Zionism manifests in very different and very particular ways, and we can see it in a lot of different economic agreements, specifically in the Arab world. So another example of this, for example, in Egypt, a U.S. brokered deal between Egypt and Israel was the sale of natural gas that's produced in Egypt for lower cost than the labor is worth. And this was contingent, like Egyptian aid from the United States. Foreign aid was contingent upon the signing of this agreement, and Egypt is a country where there's a 90 million person population, and the vast majority is below the poverty line. So these kind of imperial relationships are also creating heightened class divides and class tensions in the different Arab countries. And there are countless other examples that expand beyond just the bordering nations with Palestine. But I think I'm going to depart from there into looking a little bit at some of the impacts of Zionism on the far diaspora or the Western diaspora. And this manifests differently in different places, but I think one of the things, because our struggle has been a 70-year struggle, it's been a continual sort of political, social, cultural battle, and there is no homeland or land base for us to, we're a transnational diasporic community. We're based all over the world, and so our sort of political trajectory has manifested in different ways in each of the different decades since the Nakba. And one of the things that I think is really impacting Palestinian young people or people in general in the far diaspora are these, dealing with trauma, also dealing with the dislocation and disconnection from the homeland, as well as this sense of a lack of a sense of belonging. And this has been exacerbated by the post-Oslo period, in which the sort of Palestinian national movement preceding Oslo, which had unified interests and goals and desires, and thus was able to sort of function and find a national home in the diaspora, transnational national home, was shattered. And so Oslo serves as a rupture. And so we're in a moment right now where Palestinians are, the Zionist impact on Palestinians in the diaspora is really one that is serving to fragment us even more. And it's producing a lot of challenges in terms of how to know how to navigate our situation and try to continue the fight when there's not this cohesive structure for us to mobilize through. So I think I'm gonna pass it over to Nadia at this point.
Thanks, Jimmy. So I know we might be moving a little quickly through some of the examples, and it's fine during Q&A if you want us to go back to something very particular, like perhaps, rehash some examples of the way that, these imperial relationships happen in the region between governments. And so, whether it be the gas deal that Jennifer was talking about in Egypt, it could be, for example, the Dead Sea mud and beauty industry in Jordan, where we know very well that on the Jordanian side of the Dead Sea, right, according to Israel's occupation and the line, as borders go, that there are more minerals on the eastern bank. And kind of what that means is that there is more factory power by the state of Israel than there is by Jordan. So the minerals are taken from, the Jordanian side of the Dead Sea, and they are exported basically, 5 minutes to a factory settlement, as Jennifer was saying, and then they are produced and they're brought back to Jordan to sell to religious pilgrims, etc., who are buying, Dead Sea products, beauty products, holy products, things like that. And they have a label that says, made in Jordan, but we know actually that there's a fusion and that the majority of the manufacturing that happens is actually through Israeli factories and manufacturing, which is not, rare, really. If we look around the world, we see plenty of examples where raw materials are taken from their source, produced in a global north country or in a country that has, more, power and a better structural framework to manufacture these things, and then sold back to the place where they the materials first came from, right? And it gets much more complicated when we talk about technology, but we will delve into that in a little bit. So that's just another example. And I think what's important to gather from this last section that Jennifer was talking about is the way in which the Israeli state secures itself regionally by anchoring itself through different economies, through different diplomatic relations, through agreements of having certain roles in the region that the United States then draws benefit to those Arab states that, work to secure Israel's placement in the region. I mean, we can look at, Egypt, we can look at Jordan, we can look at Lebanon, and so many other places. I mean, we can talk about the gas deal as well that's happening with the natural gas coming out of Gaza and the Leviathan gas field, which Cyprus is, has permitted Israel to start drilling off of the shores, and they're working together in order to cultivate the gas that is off the coast of the Gaza Strip, right? And so it's very interesting because what we find is that, the Zionism might not manifest itself in the region through the actual creation of a broader nation state in terms of expanding, past the West Bank and whatever, but it does in terms of the power that it holds in the region and the framework that it creates to, of course, secure itself through the development of industry, through the development of diplomatic relations, as we've just said. And so when we start talking about the way in which the state of Israel functions globally, I think there are a couple of, historical contextualizations I'm going to give, but what we're really looking at are these things. It's arms trade, So who Israel arms and why? We're going to look at the tech industry a little bit, and we're going to, of course, talk about borders, right? Which, just again, as I said earlier, we're going to kind of stay on this topic of immigration flow. So one of the, I think, more famous examples now that we have, and a lot of this information, by the way, I'm going to pull is from the International Jewish Anti-Zionist Network. I'm going to actually plug in a link to the chat in a little bit. They have a great report from 2016 about the different arms trades that Israel has been involved in around the world throughout the years. Also, there's a really excellent book that Gabriel Chavon has recently written. The foreword is by Noam Chomsky. And so you can pre-order the book. It's called Making the New Illegal: How Decades of U.S. Involvement in Central America Triggered the Modern Wave of Immigration. And Gabe has been writing about this issue for a long time. So those are just two resources that I would recommend. And the IGN report you can find in many languages online. And so just to pull a little bit from Gabe's research, you know, he looks at the way in which the military cooperation between Israel and Guatemala can be traced back, you know, through the 1960s. And so basically, General Rio Monts came to power through a coup d'etat in '82. And basically, by the time that he did come to power, Israel had become Guatemala's main provider of weapons, their main provider of military training, surveillance technologies, and other vital assistance, basically, for the state's war. And Rio Monts is famous for persecuting the left in Guatemala, so particularly rural indigenous Mayans who are rising up, talking about land rights and, you know, their own ability to form community without being persecuted, urban leftists as well, and particularly, you know, Marxists and social Dems were attacked by the Monts regime. And so it's interesting because Monts's, you know, reign technically was very short, but it was very brutal. And so how did Israel, you know, kind of help Guatemala's state repression? Well, Israel saw an opportunity to make a lot of money out of the war the civil war, when the Jimmy Carter administration actually restricted Guatemala's military aid, right? Because there was an outcry of criticism about human rights abuses. And so by the time Monts comes to power, basically Israel had already you know, funneled in tons of, you know, literally guns, literally grenades, literally arms, in order to fuel what was happening in Guatemala. And by the time, I guess, if we look at the 80s, Israel had an estimated 300 advisors in Guatemala, specifically around, you know, military operations on the ground. And, you know, there are lots of quotes, like, you know, Gabe collected one from the Israeli Minister of Economy at the time in '82, who said, "We will say to the Americans, don't compete with us in Taiwan, don't compete with us in South Africa, don't compete with us in the Caribbean or in other places where you cannot sell arms directly. Let us do it. Israel will be your intermediary." Basically saying, if you want to fund civil unrest and you know, the reproductions of these coups d'etats that are running rampantly through El Salvador, through Nicaragua, through Honduras, through Panama, through you know, Argentina and Chile, if the U.S. is unable to bring arms and funnel arms to these Latin American countries to support the regimes that are rising up against democratically elected leaders, where the U.S. cannot do it, Israel is willing to fill that gap. And I think that's extremely important when we look not just at the ways in which the U.S. is guilty for the, you know, literal overturning of countries, economies, lives, and states in South and Central America, but also in the way that Israel is complicit and profited off of the war industry and the war economy. We know also that the United States donates, not just billions of dollars to the state of Israel, but literal military aid. Yeah. So it's a really important aspect. And I think, another thing when Jennifer was talking earlier about, states that are trying to rise up against colonial powers, kind of old school colonial powers, and it turns into kind of moving into the new age of imperialism and imperial powers. You have an aligning of imperial powers against global South states who are rising up for independence and liberation. So a great example is Israel arming Portugal against national liberation movements in Mozambique, Angola, Guinea-Bissau. You see Israel funding and training military repression of anti-colonial uprisings in the Ivory Coast, in the Central African Republic, in Benin, and Cameroon, and Senegal, and Togo, and Uganda, and Nigeria, and Somalia, right? You get the point. There's tons of examples, and we even see today that Israel has a very strong relationship with the state of Togo. And so what this means is that it's not just military actually to transition into the tech industry. What's really crucial to think about are also, again, some of the materials that are being drawn from these countries in order to make the technology that we're calling on from the webinar, our phones, things like that. I mean, they're coming from the Central African Republic. They're coming from places like Uganda, like the Ivory Coast. And so what that does is also, instead of just securing and consolidating power, it also plays in, again, into industry and the diplomatic relations and between countries in order to basically oppress people for profit and for power between countries, right? To upkeep the hegemony that's happening in the global north. And so, I think some of us are not more, I think, mainstream. If we're speaking that way, we're not really aware of some of these smaller states. We think a lot more about Israel and Rhodesia, Israel and apartheid South Africa, which are all very important, of course. But there are examples that are rampant throughout Southeast Asia, as we're seeing in Burma with the Rohingya, for example, and the genocide of the Rohingya people by using Israeli arms, and etc. So anyways, basically, these are some of the examples that we have. And so just to move into tech, I think it's really important to talk about the biometric information. So we're talking about biometrics in the West Bank through Hewlett-Packard cards, and in Gaza, in the prison system, within Palestine. And so, what does that mean? That means that, Palestinians now, instead of just giving a paper piece of an identity card, are now, which is awful as well, it plays into the exact same system. Now the high-tech version is that Israel's getting their fingerprints, it's having facial recognition, there's iris scans, for example, and it's become such a successful model for security and securitization, right? But really the militarization of these borders, that it's been exported to California prison system, for example, and also to our own borders in the United States, such as in airports and, on our northern and southern borders. And so this is kind of, I will touch on the wall briefly, but this is kind of where, again, we see Silicon Valley, which is very close to the place where Jennifer and I are from in the Bay Area. It has good relationships with the Israeli state. And so it's also, there's this industry connection again, and we don't think about it, we don't question it because it's technology and it's progression for all of us. It's able to connect with each other. But, you know, the issue is that it's also easier to track us, put us into databases, and we don't question what that information will be used for and by whom. And so just to kind of wrap up on some of these contextual examples so that we can kind of move into the final points of this conversation and maybe some Q&A to have some conversations with y'all, is looking at the way in which, for example, you know, militarizing a country and supporting a dictator, let's say in Guatemala, is not just something that happens in the 60s, 70s, and 80s. We still have a heavy flow of Central American, Guatemalan refugees and migrants coming up, you know, through the southern border of the United States, through the southern border of Mexico, and through the northern border of Mexico, where they're running into what? A wall, right? Where they're running into a very visibly militarized border. Also through the south of Mexico, where they're running into a wall that is now being constructed and has been, you know, is being constructed. And so, you know, that's one. The other is the aspect of keeping tabs, you know, keeping certain people in and keeping certain people out of borders. And of course, the underlying aspect of not just the violence of this, of separating people from each other and profiting off of that and profiting off of the violence that they're running from, is that fundamentally it makes it really difficult for nation states, for their leaders, and for people in power there to question the fundamental you know, claim that Zionism makes in the region, because, and excuse me, in Palestine, in the Middle East, and globally. And in terms of the claim of having, you know, the Israeli democratic state, of having, you know, a state that is not settler colonial by nature, that is not inherently violent, it becomes very hard to challenge that because of these systems of hegemonic power that basically various states rely on, you know, in order to secure their own power, their own structures in their present states. Right. And so I think finally, if we just talk about, you know, the wall, and maybe, Jennifer, you can talk about the prisons a little bit, or do you want to talk about the wall and the prisons?
You can talk about the wall.
Yeah.
So one of the very, I think, concrete manifestations of this sort of shared technological expansion for the suppression of people is the surveillance technology and these different technologies that are being used in different institutions. So when we look at the US-Mexico border, for example, oh, and by the way, I just wanted to say that not only the examples that Nadia brought up, but many other ones that are go through by region, how Zionism impacts different countries in different regions, is all available in a very short and concise but very useful way in the IJAN, the International Jewish Anti-Zionist Network, Worldwide Repression research project, which we will put a link for after we're done talking in the chat. But one of the things that I think is a really obvious connection is that one of the companies building the US-Mexico border is the Israeli company building the wall in Palestine to annex more land and to make sure that it is a surveillance apparatus. So this company that's helping manufacture the wall, Elbit Systems, is also a company that is producing surveillance technologies and installing surveillance technologies along borders. So like when you see different cameras or what have you, or sniper towers and those kinds of things, this is sort of this merging of technology and the sort of racial segregation that these things reproduce. If we look at, for example, police brutality is a very big issue, for example, in the United States and the prison system. So a lot of these surveillance technologies are used in particularly private prisons. So the mass expansion of the privatization of prisons means profit for companies that serve government aspirations to repress colonized peoples, people of color, and any sort of unwanted or uncared for social formations in their respective countries. So this works to sort of repress Black, brown, undocumented, Native, and other folks in this country. And of course beyond. So these are just some of the concrete connections that I think, the last thing I want to talk about actually is the militarization of our police here specifically, before we move into the very end of our presentation. But the militarization of the police is actually a key component in terms of how, like, these two states, the United States and Israel, are really co-constructing one another, where we see a lot of our local police departments actually being trained by not police, the Israeli military, the Israeli occupation forces, and the Mossad, as well as other intelligence institutions. So for example, a lot of police locally have been trained and been like funded and sponsored to go on delegations to do trainings by Israel with the Israeli intelligence and military institutions. So our police are actively being sought out and are actively going to be trained and militarizing themselves. And so this is where, for example, in Ferguson, we're seeing literally the same repressive tactics of demonstrations that the Israeli military is using on Palestinians, again by United States police against brown and black bodies predominantly here. So the use of tear gas canisters, exactly the same as those weapons that are being developed and used in by the Israeli state. So a lot of connections are actually very concrete. And so I think that moves us into what are some concrete ways in which we can mobilize against these sort of relationships. And so I think really engaging in these local and national issues to, remove the wall, for example, and to end surveillance on the wall and to open our borders. That is a direct step against both the promotion of Israeli profit as well as the promotion of Israeli surveillance and violent tactics against oppressed folks. Same thing with trying to end state relationships, state and local relationships, police and intelligence relationships with the Israeli state. To end that sort of cooperation is another way in which we can mobilize. Ending different surveillance programs like the Countering Violent Extremism program in our local cities, ending ICE coordination with our local police and local cities, the Stop Urban Shields campaign, if some of you all have heard of it, which is Urban Shield is a basically like an arms convention where people get together and buy weapons and check out the latest technology. And Israel's a consistent and very big consistent participant and a very big presenter at this annual Urban Shield meetings around the country. And so putting pressure against things like that. In addition to continuing to raise awareness about these issues and these connections in our local communities, because I think one of the most convicting ways to mobilize people around struggles that they may not see as like things they should care about or as things that are immediately impacting them is to actually expose them to all these connections. So of course raising awareness is very pivotal on these issues, and then we move beyond, right? And then we move to the action and we try to do the local base building in order to create or join these different campaigns to end this kind of coordination.
Yeah, great.
Do you want to add anything?
I mean, just as Jennifer said, we have to really engage in our local communities and see the ways in which, security and military apparatuses are working within the communities that we live in and with folks who are most vulnerable to state violence. And so that is a burden of responsibility that we all have to our folks in the communities that we see every day, that we work with, and then folks who are there but who we may not see and who we may not interface with on a regular basis. Again, as Jennifer said, it's really important for us to do this research and to kind of ask also. A lot of the times people in the communities that are most affected by said issues of militarization, kettling techniques that are coming from Palestine through the Israeli military training, they see it because they experience it every day. And so it's important to ask and take leadership also from folks who are most affected so that we can all work together to get these, oppressive forces out of our community. Because I can think of very few reasons why we would justify them being present, but the justifications that we have, I think we have to think back to a security narrative and what does security mean? Who is it really securitizing? What is militarization really doing for us in terms of fragmentation and dispossession, rather than the protection of a material good or as a way of life that we might have been used to. And so on that, I think maybe we can open it up to Q&A if that would be okay.
Or comments.
Or comments also. And you can see that Jennifer just posted a URL of the IGEN report. I can also look for Gabe's book if anyone's interested as well, or maybe one of his articles.
Thank you both so much for all that information. If folks want to chat in their questions, we can definitely take some. We have about 10 minutes for questions, so please feel free to chat them in. I think as Nadia and Jennifer were saying, there's a lot of different ways Zionism and Israel are contributing to oppression all around, and I think it's very significant that these technologies that they've used to really destroy Palestinian lives. I think the use of drones is a very clear example of Israel developed drone technology, experimented with drone technology on Palestinians, particularly Palestinians in Gaza, and has sold drones from everywhere from India to Russia to Brazil, and is just really making a ton of money off of this experimentation that they have had on Palestinians for so long. Yeah, Catherine, I think they just posted, if you scroll up, the IGEN's research report is the link that they were citing. And it's a really great report that looks like historically what Israel, its role in repression, and how it's helped all kinds of regimes repress movements for justice and equality all across.
Mm-hmm.
And this is Anna, we have quite a few people watching on Facebook Live. I think if you're able to put your questions in comments, I'll try to read them out.
Great, thank you. And thank you so much. And just as we, just to reflect on something that you said, Rama, actually, the Israeli government and corporations play a really significant role in Brazil's domestic policing and crowd control, surveillance systems, and the militarization of their borders as well. So, just like here in the United States, the police is training and arming the Brazilian police. Training and arming is part of Brazil's anti-favela campaign and other domestic repression, and that's fueled with Israeli techniques. They are funded to go to Israel and train just like our police here. And Brazil's actually contracted with Israel to provide an advanced surveillance system in its state prisons as well. And also, God, what was the statistic? Do you remember, Jennifer? After India, Brazil is the largest
I
purchaser?
don't remember the order, but U.S., Brazil, Brazil and India are two of the largest purchasers of Israeli weapons.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And so when Rama just brought up drones, absolutely, it's a very concrete example.
So I have a question. Are still gathering their thoughts. In terms of, so it's very, I think, when people think, okay, what does this mean in terms of our day-to-day organizing in support of Palestinian rights? There's very clear, like, okay, the corporations that we can target in our boycott divestment campaigns, as Jennifer mentioning, it's the same. Elbit is going to help building surveillance tower on the U.S.-Mexico border. There's companies that are bidding for the wall that have helped build the wall. So that's a very concrete kind of campaign-wise what we can do. But I was just thinking in terms of more general, the way we think about Palestine and the way we think about the reasons we support Palestinian rights and the struggle for freedom, justice, and equality there. How does that play into just the way we think about the struggle in general?
So I think, can I take this?
Please.
I think one of the very important lessons that PYM has learned because of our context as a transnational youth organization is that our vision for transnationalism and international struggle is very much situated in the local. And so we're really firm in believing that in order to engage in a liberation struggle for Palestine and on a global level, we also need to first be really conscious of what's happening in the places and the locations that we're living in, and how we can do our part to be accountable to the most vulnerable people in the communities that we live in and to take leadership from those most affected. And so that varies from city to city and state to state, but that's a general frame in which we try to approach our work. And that's a frame for us building our community relationships and then introducing these kinds of connections to the folks that are actually the most vulnerable as a result of these connections. Yeah.
Thank you. There was a question that came in related to what you were saying, Jennifer, with Palestinians displaced in the West dealing with trauma, lacking a sense of belonging. And if there's, the person is asking, are there ways to support be relevant for non-Palestinian comrades who may also be displaced themselves from other nations? Or is that an internal conversation within the Palestinian community that needs to be had? So I guess how people who are in solidarity with Palestinians can relate to this trauma support Palestinians may be feeling in the West.
Yeah, I think that's an issue that can be sort of addressed and explored in multiple ways. I think one really important way for us to sort of rebuild what has been missing for a couple decades now in our community is to have the space to really empower ourselves and empower Palestinian, especially young people, to become responsible and committed to and become their own active agents first for their own liberation. And I think that comes with a lot of different ways of struggling through different kinds of issues and the patience to kind of enable that to happen. The information gap that may sometimes be felt is it's politically and historically situated, and it's a result of the perpetuation of Zionism in the different places that we live. And so I think giving the time and the space to empower, but then also I think, I don't know what particular communities you all may be from, but I think also sharing different sort of tactics and strategies for navigating these questions between Palestinian young people and young folks from other communities who may be facing similar challenges is always, I think, beneficial and an important part of connecting locally.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and I think oftentimes, again, depending on the communities, we have a historical representation of the way in which, or I mean, real relationships and the ways in which the Palestinian communities in exile have interacted with other communities who are also in exile, who have been displaced. And I think that remembering those, context, remembering those histories, and acting in the wiser, basically, through knowing what our elders have done is really empowering, because it means that we don't have to reinvent the ways in which we engage with each other. And also, regardless, there is a foundation that folks in exile around the world have to each other, and that is by the very basis of dispossession. And often, as we have been outlining kind of in the ways that Zionism and different global North powers interact with each other and support each other through New Age imperialism, it really also denotes, and it can be found in some of the ways in which many of us have been dispossessed and some of the root causes of our dispossession, some of the root forces of our dispossession. And I think just so we're not, completely victimized by that narrative, we as people who are, rooted in particular struggles or histories or places even, have power and can gather power from the context and from the very places that we come from, and from our aspects of resilience and resistance.
Okay, well, our time is up. So thank you again so much, Nadia and Jennifer, for your thoughts. Thank you, everyone, for joining us. We'll be putting this recording up on our website, on our curriculum. I urge everyone to go check it out. You can find it at uscpr.org/Together We Rise. Thank you again, everyone, and have a wonderful evening.
Thank